Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling cases in New York City's documented history. Please let me know where you're watching from and when you first heard this story in the comments section before we start. We want to know where these recorded accounts come from and what time of day or night they arrive. As the Great War raged across Europe in the fall of 1917, the upper classes of New York City continued to host extravagant parties behind closed doors. Reports of influenza breakouts, wartime rations, and overseas casualties were all over the headlines. However, life went on virtually unhindered on Fifth Avenue, where the wealthiest families lived. Nearly. The Blackwood Mansion, a massive 4-story, 27-room Beaux Arts building made of marble and limestone, was located at 721 Fifth Avenue. The sole heir to the Blackwood Railroad fortune, Eleanor Blackwood, held one of the most esteemed places in New York society here. She was 32 years old, single, and in charge of what many people calculated to be $15 million, a huge amount at the time. Eleanor was well known for her winter charity dances, her philanthropic contributions to the Metropolitan Opera, and her sophisticated taste in art. For almost 50 years, what was unknown about Eleanor Blackwood would be kept secret until a remodeling in 1963 exposed something that went against what society thought of the respectable heir. Construction workers discovered a number of carefully arranged objects in the basement of the mansion's east wing, hidden behind a false wall. Ledgers with thorough financial transaction information, a variety of identification documents under various names. On wooden stands are a number of homemade wigs. A compilation of missing person stories from the Northeast's newspapers. The foreman of the renovations called the police right away. However, what they discovered was swiftly concealed, only to reappear in bits and pieces decades later in declassified internal memos. These records seem to indicate that Eleanor Blackwood was living two rather distinct lives. In the 1,880 seconds, the Blackwood family had made their fortune by expanding the railroad. Eleanor's father, Thomas Blackwood, was a notoriously cutthroat businessman who bought down faltering railroad lines throughout the Midwest and Northeast. In 1910, their only daughter Eleanor inherited everything when he and his wife Caroline passed away within months of one another from what were reported to be pneumonia-related problems. Before her parents passed away, Eleanor had taken many trips throughout Europe and attended private schools in Boston. According to acquaintances, she was quiet, perceptive, and incredibly calm. Prior to her parents' deaths, she hardly ever went to social events, but she later became a major player in New York culture. She was always immaculately dressed, but there was something in her eyes that seemed to be evaluating everyone around her. Margaret Astor said in a 1916 private letter, "When she looked at you, you felt as though you were being appraised rather than seen." The odd thing about Eleanor is how little we know about her personally prior to the passing of her parents. At the Boston institutions where she allegedly studied, no school records were ever found. As was occasionally popular for portrait photography of the time, the few images that do exist depict a slender woman with black hair who is always dressed up and has her face partially hidden by veils or shadows. With the exception of one housemaid who lived elsewhere, the mansion's crew included a butler, 2 housemaids, a cook, and a gardener. The odd thing is that Eleanor seemed to have very clear rules about who employees may enter certain areas of the house. The only employees allowed access to the East Wing were Eleanor and her personal maid, Harriet Walsh, on occasion. Walsh would go on to become a prominent role in the inquiry. But there are still many unresolved issues in this case, including her ultimate destiny. The household account books that have survived and the testimony of James Barrow, the gardener at Blackwood from 1911 to 1919, are the main sources of what we do know. 4 years prior to the renovation discovery, in 1959, Barrow recalled a number of odd patterns in the home in an oral history he conducted for Columbia University. Miss Blackwood would disappear for days at a time, he said. The staff was instructed to maintain normal operations and told she was visiting friends in Rhode Island or Connecticut. But I maintained the grounds year-round and never once saw luggage being taken to or from a car when these supposed trips occurred. Barrow claims that Eleanor would frequently withdraw to the East Wing and that staff members were expressly told not to bother her there, not even in case of an emergency. There was a separate entrance to that section of the house, Barrow said. He once told Mr. Fleming the butler that, "Sometimes I'd be working near the east garden and hear that door open and close, but Miss Blackwood was supposedly away." He became quite upset and told him he must have been wrong. This memory is especially noteworthy because it corresponds with some anomalies in the home ledgers. The kitchen was still cooking for someone on the east wing, while Eleanor Blackwood was supposedly away. Even during her alleged weeks-long absence, coal supplies for heating that part continued unabated. More unsettling information was revealed by the ledgers discovered in 1963 behind the false wall. They recorded large cash withdrawals from a number of banks in New York and New England, all from accounts that were supposedly under Eleanor's control but had different names. The amounts were accurately recorded, along with the dates and places that went with them. The newspaper clippings were even more disturbing. Between 1911 and 1917, they recorded the disappearances of at least 11 people. They were all young ladies in the 18-25 age range. They were all reported as having dark hair and pale complexions, and all had vanished from places where Eleanor had taken out cash within days of the disappearance, based on the financial records. The most extensive collection of clippings concerned a teenage shop girl named Catherine Miller, who disappeared in April 1913 from Hartford, Connecticut. Miller's case is noteworthy because her father was a well-respected physician in the region, and her abduction attracted a lot of media attention. According to the investigation, Miller had been offered a job as a lady's companion for a wealthy widow, which would have paid her 3 times her shop income. She never came back after meeting this possible employer. For almost 2 weeks, the Hartford Courant published daily updates on the case. According to Eleanor's ledgers, she had been in Hartford the day before Miller vanished, taken a sizable amount out of an account she had opened under the name Elizabeth Winters, and left for New York the following day. Catherine Miller was never seen again. However, 3 different handwriting samples were discovered in the secret ledgers by investigators in 1963. One matched Eleanor's known letters and was unmistakably hers. The identity of the second was unknown. Following forensic analysis, the third was found to match handwriting samples of Catherine Miller from letters her family had saved. This raises the possibility that Catherine Miller was taken to the Blackwood estate. However, in what role? Did she refuse to be held? Was she forced to take part in Eleanor's double life in any way? Following Miller's disappearance, the ledgers show entries in this third handwriting for around 8 months before abruptly ceasing. One particularly unsettling entry, written in what is thought to be Miller's handwriting, dates the 18th of December 1913. The posture-changing exercises are uncomfortable but effective. "I have become proficient in the voice," he says. "My Connecticut accent still emerges when I am tired. Must practice more." This implies that Miller might have been undergoing training to become another Eleanor or to mimic someone else. What happened to these ladies who went missing is still a mystery. When the property was renovated in 1963 and later investigated, no human remains were discovered. There was no indication that the basement space where the documents were concealed had ever been utilized for a detention. With a desk, chair, and other equipment for making wigs and mending clothes, it actually looked more like a study or workshop. However, investigators did discover comprehensive guidelines for altering one's voice, look, and demeanor. These were detailed notes that explained how to change posture to make one appear taller or shorter, how to change speech patterns to imply different educational backgrounds, and how to use subtle makeup techniques to give the appearance of varied ages. This leads us to what is arguably the most unsettling possibility. Eleanor Blackwood might not have been holding these women captive, but rather temporarily taking on their identities. This notion is supported by the assortment of wigs in various hues of brown and black that were discovered in the concealed room. So do the several sets of identification documents that were found, each of which included a picture of a woman who looked a lot like Eleanor, but had minor physical distinctions. The reason is yet unknown. One of the wealthiest women in New York was Eleanor Blackwood. She possessed freedom, authority, and social position that were uncommon for women in her time. What would motivate her to fabricate complex false identities? And what became of the missing women? We need to learn more about the Blackwood family's past and the circumstances behind her parents' deaths in order to comprehend Eleanor. As was already reported, pneumonia was the cause of death for Thomas and Caroline Blackwood in 1910. Thomas and Caroline passed away in January and April, respectively, within 3 months of one another. Both death certificates were signed by Dr. Philip Harrington, the family doctor. Notably, Dr. Harrington passed away suddenly from what was reportedly heart failure in October of the same year. Any inquiries concerning the Blackwoods' ailments perished with the doctor, even though he was just 53 years old and had no known history of cardiac issues. However, domestic workers later stated that Caroline Blackwood had been in good health prior to her husband's passing. Some staff members privately expressed surprise at how rapidly and severely her condition deteriorated, but her rapid fall after that was attributed to grief. This enigma is further complicated by a statement made to authorities in 1963 by Margaret Shaw, a housemaid for the Blackwoods from 1909 to 1911. Shaw, who was in her 72nd at the time, said that Thomas Blackwood had developed a psychotic fear of poisoning in the weeks preceding his death. He would only eat food that was prepared specifically for him by Mrs. Blackwood, Shaw said. He refused anything from the kitchen and became terribly thin. He accused everyone in the household of trying to kill him, even his own daughter. Miss Blackwood said it was just his mind failing, but he seemed lucid enough when discussing anything else. Eleanor assumed responsibility for her mother's care when Thomas Blackwood passed away, frequently delivering her meals and medication herself. Within weeks, Caroline Blackwood was bedridden due to her rapid decline. During her last days, Dr. Harrington and Eleanor were the only people permitted in her chamber. Was Eleanor Blackwood accountable for the murders of her parents? Even though the evidence is completely circumstantial, the timing is suspect, particularly in light of Eleanor's inheriting of the whole Blackwood wealth and Dr. Harrington's later death. Another possible motivation is shown by examining Thomas Blackwood's 1,909 business correspondence that was found in the major bank's preserved records. Concerned about his daughter's mental health, Blackwood wrote to his lawyer that he was thinking of getting her committed. He continues to exhibit troubling behaviors, he stated. No record exists of this consultation ever occurring, and Thomas Blackwood passed away 3 months after writing this letter. The incidents with the household staff are increasing in frequency, and her explanations grow less convincing. Caroline refuses to acknowledge the severity of the situation, but I fear we can no longer delay seeking professional intervention. Please arrange a private consultation with Dr. Bancroft at Westbrook Sanatorium at your earliest convenience. Did Eleanor know what her father was planning? Did the Blackwood family experience any negative consequences as a result of this? Regardless of the truth about her parents, Eleanor was among the richest women in New York by 1911 and seemed to be constructing the complex double life that the hidden ledgers describe. Only 5 months after Caroline Blackwood's passing, in September 1911, the first newspaper articles concerning missing women appeared. Jane Porter, a 22-year-old music instructor from Albany, was the first person to go missing. Porter was last seen heading for what she claimed to be an appointment with a wealthy prospective student after advertising her services in local publications. Her things were discovered in her room, packed as though she had anticipated coming back. According to Eleanor's ledgers, she had taken out cash from an Albany bank using the name Margaret Wells on the day Porter vanished. Meals were still being prepared for someone in the East Wing during Eleanor's 10-day trip, according to entries in the Blackwood household accounts 2 weeks later. Over the following 6 years, this pattern would recur with unsettling regularity. A woman would go missing, generally after receiving a job offer. Activity would occur at the same place at the same time, according to Eleanor's financial records. After that, she was intended to travel for a while someone was still living in the mansion's East Wing. Although the workers hardly ever saw these said visitors, James Barrow remembered seeing a woman who looked like Eleanor on occasion, but who he was informed was a visiting friend or cousin. They looked similar enough that you might think they were related, but something was always off about these visitors, he said. They never spoke to the staff directly, and Miss Blackwood was always very insistent that they not be disturbed. In his testimony, Barrow described a particularly telling episode that happened in the summer of 1914. A window opened on the second floor while I was pruning the roses near the East Wing. A young woman looked out. At first I thought it was Miss Blackwood, but she called down to ask if I was the gardener. Her voice wasn't right, it was higher, and it had a different rhythm. When I said yes, she asked if I could bring fresh flowers for her room. I said I'd need to ask Miss Blackwood first, because we had strict instructions about the East Wing. When he brought up the incident later that day, Miss Blackwood informed him that he must have been mistaken, and that no one was currently staying in the East Wing. Eleanor's personal maid, Harriet Walsh, may have had additional information, although it is unclear where she went after 1917. Household records show that Walsh received a sizable severance payment upon his dismissal in November 1917. Unusually for a personal maid who had worked for a number of years, no explanation for her dismissal was offered, and no letter of recommendation was included. Census data and a brief interview Walsh provided to the New York Sun in 1916 for a feature on the lifestyles of New York's elite are the only sources of information about her. Walsh said in the interview that her job was ordinary aside from being careful and sensitive to her privacy. Among her responsibilities, she said, were keeping up Miss Blackwood's clothes, helping with letters, and even going shopping with her. The household accounts show that she was paid over 3 times the average salary for a lady's maid, which Walsh did not mention. Additionally, she was frequently rewarded with incentives, which were recorded in the ledgers and frequently correlated with Eleanor's alleged absences from the estate. Was Walsh involved in anything Eleanor did? Did she know the real nature of what was going on in the East Wing, or was she being compensated for her silence? Walsh's termination occurs at the same time as the final recorded disappearance in Eleanor's collection of newspaper clippings. The October 1917 disappearance of Grace Bennett, a 24-year-old Boston nurse. The stories regarding Bennett, in contrast to the other clippings, were not just gathered, they were also noted in Eleanor's handwriting, with mysterious remarks like unsuitable temperament and too much family inquiry. Bennett had just graduated from nursing school and had received an offer to take care of an elderly woman in a private house, according to the Boston Globe's story of her abduction. She assured her roommate that the job was extremely lucrative and would enable her to earn enough money to start her own practice in a year. On the 17th of October 1917, she left for her new job and was never seen again. Using the name Victoria Caldwell, Eleanor's ledgers reveal that she was in Boston on October 16 and 17, lodging at the Parker House Hotel. On October 18, she made her way back to New York. Harriet Walsh was told to get the blue guest room in the East Wing ready for a visitor on October 19. A little more than 2 weeks later, on November 3, Walsh was released from service. The household accounts indicate that by November 10, no more meals were being made for the East Wing, and the guest room was no longer being maintained. Bennett's abduction and Walsh's firing seem to have put an end to whatever Eleanor Blackwood was doing. The most plausible interpretation is that Walsh had learned of her employer's actions and had either been threatened with disclosure or compensated for her silence. This leads us to the winter of 1918, a time of great change in Eleanor Blackwood's public life. She started to distance herself from people, turning down most invitations and canceling her yearly charity ball. Rumor had it that she was ill with an unidentified condition by spring. In May 1918, she made her final public appearance at a Liberty Bond drive, where several guests remarked on how emaciated and pale she looked. In a letter to a friend, Eleanor's novelist Edith Wharton wrote, "Poor E. was at the Heirs last night, looking like a ghost of herself. Something has gone out of her." That spark of calculation that always animated her eyes has been replaced by something I can only describe as dread. One wonders what she has seen, or perhaps what she has done. Eleanor had entirely distanced herself from public life by June. She was deemed too sick to receive guests at the mansion. After taking over a large portion of Dr. Harrington's practice, Dr. Edwin Morris began to frequently visit the house, sometimes spending hours there. The New York Times announced on the 3rd of August 1918 that Eleanor Blackwood had passed away due to influenza-related complications. Her body was promptly buried in the family mausoleum in Brooklyn's Greenwood Cemetery, rather than being set out for viewing as was customary. Despite the fact that the 1918 influenza pandemic had just started to strike New York at the time, Only a few distant family members and business associates attended the modest funeral. With significant bequests to the New York Public Library and the Metropolitan Opera, Eleanor's will distributed the majority of her wealth to several charitable organizations. The revenues from the sale of the mansion were to be donated to a charitable organization. Concerns about influenza transmission at the time made this unique requirement that her personal items be destroyed uncommon. This may have been the story's conclusion. When a wealthy, eccentric woman passes away at a young age, her fortune is donated to worthy causes. However, what transpired next points to something much more unsettling. A brownstone in Boston's Back Bay district was bought by a woman named Victoria Caldwell in September 1918, a few weeks after Eleanor's funeral. The real estate records indicate that Miss Postum Caldwell was a widow who had recently moved from Chicago following the wartime death of her husband. She was described as independent, well-spoken, and in her early 30s. It should sound familiar to hear the name Victoria Caldwell. Eleanor had gone to Boston under the same disguise shortly before Grace Bennet vanished. And now, in Boston, the place from which Bennet had disappeared, someone had taken up residence under his identity. Victoria Caldwell made a name for herself in Boston society as a significant giver to war relief operations and a lover of the arts. Photographs from social gatherings in Boston depict a slender woman with her dark hair done in a stylish bob. She frequently wore veils or big hats that partially covered her face. Victoria Caldwell's accounts were financed by transfers from a New York bank that had handled some of the Blackwood assets, according to documents from the Atlantic Bank of Boston. Days before Eleanor's alleged death, the transfers were approved, indicating a degree of preparation that is hard to reconcile with an unexpected sickness. Without a fortuitous meeting in 1920, the parallels between Victoria Caldwell and Eleanor Blackwood could have gone unnoticed. A frequent attendee of Eleanor's parties in New York, Evelyn Parker was in Boston when she went to a concert to raise money for veterans. After meeting Victoria Caldwell there, Parker said in a letter to her sister that she felt the most unsettling sense of familiarity. "I could swear I was speaking to Eleanor Blackwood," she added, when she told her hostess that Miss Caldwell reminded her of an old friend from New York. She was informed that Victoria had never lived in New York and had actually made disparaging remarks about the city on multiple occasions. The voice was different, higher, with a slight Western accent, but the eyes were identical. She seemed to recognize me as well, and became quite flustered, excusing herself almost immediately. The letter continues, "I am almost certainly imagining things. Eleanor has been dead for nearly 2 years, and grief sometimes plays tricks on one's memory. And yet I cannot shake the feeling that Victoria Caldwell is wearing Eleanor's eyes in a slightly different face." Parker didn't follow up on this disturbing coincidence, and until 1924, when she declared she was going to Europe for a long time, Victoria Caldwell was still a prominent member of Boston society. Her Boston property was subsequently sold for non-payment of taxes, and she never came back. Was Eleanor Blackwood really Victoria Caldwell? Although circumstantial, the evidence is strong. The fact that Caldwell showed up so soon after Eleanor's passing, the physical resemblances Evelyn Parker saw, and the enormous sums of money Caldwell had without a known source all point to the possibility that they were the same person. If so, who was interred in Greenwood Cemetery's family mausoleum in lieu of Eleanor Blackwood? We can't be sure because no exhumation was ever done. However, Eleanor's personal maid, Harriet Walsh, who was fired in November 1917 and whose whereabouts were never known, is one candidate. As a personal maid, Walsh would have had access to Eleanor's private space and belongings because he was around Eleanor's age and build. Walsh might have known too much to be let to just walk away with a severance money if Eleanor had chosen to hide her name, possibly out of fear of being found out about the disappearances. None of Walsh's relatives or former associates claim to have kept in touch with her following her expulsion from the Blackwood home, which lends credence to this notion. It's possible that the severance payment recorded in the household accounts was a front for a completely different type of transaction. This idea is further supported by the discovery made at the Blackwood mansion in 1963. A tiny notebook with what looked to be practice signatures in Harriet Walsh's handwriting, not of her own name, but of Eleanor Blackwood, was one of the objects discovered. If not directed to do so, why would a lady's maid practice her employer's signature? A partially burned letter discovered among the secret documents is much more convincing. What can be read is quite concerning, but only pieces are still readable. Cannot in good conscience continue as I have. The things I have witnessed in this house defy explanation. Miss B is not what she appears, and I fear what might happen if is read in what looks to be a letter from Walsh to an unnamed recipient. The remainder of the letter is destroyed. However, the fact that it exists indicates that Walsh had in fact learned something unsettling about her boss, which may have resulted in her termination or worse. Should Eleanor have staged her death and taken on the persona of Victoria Caldwell, it would indicate a degree of preparation and deliberation that is quite unsettling. It would imply that she was getting ready for the prospect of having to flee her own life starting in 1911 when the disappearances started. What about the ladies that are missing? What happened to them if they weren't imprisoned in the mansion? The most concerning notion is that Eleanor used them as a rehearsal run for her eventual deceit. She was able to refine her identity assuming tactics with each disappearance, including how to choose suitable targets, entice them away from their lives, and convincingly imitate their backgrounds and mannerisms. Grace Bennet may have been unsuitable because her personality was too hard to imitate convincingly, or because her disappearance attracted too much attention from her family and the authorities. The annotations on her newspaper clippings, unsuitable temperament, and too much family inquiry indicate that Eleanor was assessing these women as possible identity donors. This leads us to the most terrifying possibility, that Eleanor Blackwood's ultimate objective was to find someone appropriate to become permanently someone whose life she could fully enter, leaving her own turbulent existence behind rather than only temporarily stealing these women's identities. Has she located that individual? There are no definitive answers in the historical record. In 1924, Victoria Caldwell disappeared from Boston, supposedly to go to Europe. The trail becomes frigid after that. In the event that she was Eleanor Blackwood, she might have carried on her identity-shifting pattern throughout her life, changing identities as needed. One intriguing lead did, however, surface decades later. A woman by the name of Elizabeth Barrett opened a modest but upscale art gallery in San Francisco in 1947. Barrett identified herself as an East Coast widow who had lived in Europe for many years before relocating to California. A woman in her 60s with silver white hair and an upright stance is depicted in photographs taken at gallery openings. She frequently sports unusual pearl earrings that remarkably resemble those in one of the few surviving images of Eleanor Blackwood. Barrett's gallery focused on purchasing and reselling European art, especially pieces that had been uprooted during the conflict. She was renowned for having a keen sense of authenticity and a thorough understanding of provenance skills that would have been helpful to someone forging a new identity. Barrett presented an exhibition of paintings by a little-known Italian painter in 1952. Richard Astor, the son of Margaret Astor, who had written to Eleanor Blackwood decades before, was one of the guests. Astor was overheard telling his wife that Barrett reminded him of someone his mother had known in New York prior to the war, according to a San Francisco Chronicle Society column. In 1953, Barrett abruptly shuttered her exhibition and supposedly relocated to Mexico due to health concerns. There has never been another trace of her. Was Eleanor Blackwood reincarnated in Elizabeth Barrett? The time would be right. By then, she would have been in her mid-60s, and moving from Boston to Europe to San Francisco would have given her plenty of time to hone and reinvent herself several times. This case is especially unsettling because it provides us with insight into a mind that is capable of such deliberate deception, in addition to the possible fate of the missing ladies. If Eleanor Blackwood was the mastermind behind these identity thefts and disappearances, she showed a degree of forethought, patience, and emotional distance that is uncommon even in the most well-known crimes of the time. If the 1,963 find hadn't come at the same time as a much more urgent case that required the New York Police Department's resources, it may have resulted in a more thorough investigation. The data were turned over to federal authorities within days of the construction workers' discovery, and the refurbishment of the Blackwood estate proceeded under strict supervision. The mansion was transformed into opulent apartments by 1965, and the East Wing was entirely redesigned to remove the separate entrance and any indication of Eleanor's secret workshop. After being cataloged and placed in government archives, the papers and artifacts discovered behind the false wall were mainly forgotten until a partial declassification in 1982 revealed some of the material. The case didn't get much notice even then. The main players were long dead, or at least thought to be. The events were too far away, and the evidence was too shaky. The mystery surrounding Eleanor Blackwood and the missing ladies remained little more than a historical footnote in the absence of bodies, confessions, and any concrete evidence. However, several questions still bother those who research the case. Did Eleanor choose a new identity in Europe if she did pretend to be dead and become Victoria Caldwell, who vanished there? If so, how many times did she go through this process in her lifetime? Based on the data that is now available, a pattern emerges that points to a lady who possesses exceptional intelligence and calculation skills, enabling her to make plans years in advance. It seems as though every persona she might have adopted had been thoroughly considered, chosen, and transitioned. For example, Victoria Caldwell claimed to be from Chicago, which is not so exotic as to arouse excessive curiosity, but far enough from New York to make verification challenging. At a time when many women had lost husbands, she portrayed herself as a war widow, which made her story relatable and sufficiently commonplace to deter too many inquiries. If Elizabeth Barrett was another incarnation, she presented herself as an art expert who had lived in Europe during the war years, a background that would be very difficult to confirm in the years following World War II, when records had been destroyed all over Europe and displaced people were still being identified. Additionally, each persona had some characteristics with Eleanor's well-known tastes: a passion for the arts, a place on the outside of high society, and a meticulously preserved sense of seclusion. These were well-thought-out moves that gave her the opportunity to show the public a different side of herself while preserving elements of who she really was. Theoretically, she could have lived for several more decades, changing her identity as needed, as she was only 33 when she is said to have died in 1918. This trend might have persisted long into the middle of the 20th century for someone with her resources and obvious deception skills. Thus, the most disturbing question of all is probably how many Eleanor Blackwoods there have been in history. In fact, how many rich, solitary women have been someone else, someone who studied them, imitated them, and eventually took their place? How would we ever find out? A brief notice was published in the New York Times classified section in 1968. On August 3rd, precisely 50 years after Eleanor Blackwood's purported death, it was published with the straightforward headline, EB 1885 to 1968. The final performance has concluded. No one claimed responsibility for the notice, and its significance was not recognized until years later, when researchers connecting the declassified Blackwood files noticed the coincidence of dates. The notice was paid for in cash, and the clerk described the person who placed it as an elderly woman with remarkable posture. Was Eleanor herself making her farewell appearance? Had she spent her entire life assuming several identities just to finally realize who she really was? According to an examination of San Francisco probate documents, Elizabeth Barrett passed away in Mexico City in June 1968. Her estate, which was mostly made up of investments and artwork, was bequeathed to a number of cultural organizations in Boston, New York, and San Francisco, the locations where Victoria, Elizabeth, and Eleanor had all resided. The will's executor, a Mexican attorney, stated that he had never seen Barrett in person, and that all of their interactions had been via written correspondence. It's unlikely that we will ever be able to confirm whether these women were all the same person. In 1972, the Blackwood Mansion was razed to provide room for a contemporary apartment complex. Any bones that may have provided answers to our queries were taken and cremated as part of the restoration procedure after a storm in 1970 damaged several mausoleums at Greenwood Cemetery, including the Blackwoods. Newspaper clippings, ledger entries, pieces, and the testimony of long-dead witnesses are all that are left of this unsettling case. They only show distorted glimpses of a truth we can never entirely recreate, like fragments of a broken mirror. But maybe that makes sense. If Eleanor Blackwood was the mastermind behind this complex charade, she was more aware than most of how easily a life can be created, abandoned, and forgotten, and how brittle identity really is. Perhaps her greatest achievement was to vanish so thoroughly that we cannot be sure she ever existed at all. The missing women, however, were real. Catherine Miller was mourned by her parents. Students of Jane Porter were curious about the whereabouts of their teacher. Patients of Grace Bennett's lost their nurse. Their disappearances left questions unanswered and gaps in the world that were never filled. Therefore, technically, Eleanor Blackwood's case is still open, even if no one is left to look into it and no obvious crime has been committed. It remains now as a whisper from a bygone era, a warning that sometimes evil lurks beneath the graceful exteriors of even the most esteemed homes. Workers found a little metal box sealed within a wall cavity in 2002 while renovating one of the opulent condominiums that now stand on the site of the Blackwood house. There was only one picture in it, a group portrait of 11 young ladies standing in a semicircle, all with pale skin and dark hair. Nobody was grinning. The portrait was dated July 1917, just months before Eleanor Blackwood's social disengagement and alleged death. On the back was a single sentence, scrawled in what forensic specialists would eventually establish was Eleanor Blackwood's handwriting. My chorus of shadows. Though experts have hypothesized that the women may be the missing ones whose disappearances correlated with Eleanor's movements, the faces of the women have never been positively identified. In that case, the picture poses more queries than it resolves. Did the Blackwood house hold these ladies captive? Were they forced to take part in Eleanor's complex identity experiments in any way? Or is the picture a representation of something else entirely, like the various faces Eleanor herself wore during her peculiar and reclusive life? The last piece of this puzzle was found in 2018, when a rare book collector bought a first copy of Edith Wharton's The Age of Innocence at a Mexico City estate sale. Inside was a pressed flower and a handwritten note that said, "We wear the faces that serve us best. Some of us wear many. I have worn 11. Each one was chosen with care. Each one served its purpose, and each one was discarded when its usefulness ended. Only I remain behind every mask, watching the world believe what it sees rather than what is. This is my true legacy, not railroads or mansions, but the art of becoming someone else entirely, while never ceasing to be myself. E.B. The note has never been verified, and its clasters speculate that it might be a cunning forgery designed to capitalize on the enduring mystery surrounding Eleanor Blackwood. If true, however, it provides a terrifying glimpse into the thoughts of a woman who may have mastered identity theft to a level rarely seen in the past or present. Maybe you will think about the Blackwood heir and pause to consider who may be staring back at you the next time you pass a magnificent estate with its curtains drawn or meet the stare of a wealthy woman whose eyes appear to assess rather than see. Ultimately, what we don't know and maybe never will is what makes Eleanor Blackwood's narrative so terrifying. It is found in the gaps between the facts, in the gloom created by unsolved issues, and in the idea that someone could so totally abandon their own life and then enter another one with ease. It comes from seeing that, like any other possession, identity, that which we regard as most essential to who we are, can be created, altered, and given away. And it's the disturbing realization that we might walk by these individuals on the street every day without realizing that the face they show the world is not their own, but rather one they've carefully chosen from a closet of stolen lives. Technically, Eleanor Blackwood's case files are still open. 11 women who vanished between 1911 and 1917 are still unaccounted for. Additionally, if Eleanor did stage her death and adopt new identities, she has long ago disappeared from history, leaving behind only echoes and pieces, whispers and shadows. and the lingering doubt regarding her true identity beneath all of her meticulously crafted facades. The real tragedy of her narrative may ultimately lie in what she voluntarily did to herself, rather than what she may have done to others. She might have ended up becoming no one at all, because of her resolve to be several persons. Images from the era of Eleanor Blackwood depict a quickly evolving New York, cars giving way to cars, skyscrapers growing next to brownstones, and electric lights gradually taking the place of gas lamps. The old social order was starting to give way to something new at this time of change. Eleanor might have sensed this shift and understood that it would be harder to maintain a false identity in a society where communication and technology are connecting people more and more. Maybe this inspired her complex plan to vanish and reappear in another location. An intriguing memo from October 1963, a few weeks after the finding in the mansion, can be found in the FBI archives on the Blackwood case, which were partially declassified in 1982. The memo, written by a deputy director whose name has been blacked, states, "Investigation of subject EB to be suspended indefinitely. All materials to be classified under national security protocols. No further action authorized at this time." What would make a case involving disappearances in the 1910 seconds a national security issue in 1963? According to some scholars, during the Cold War, when creating cover identities for agents was a crucial intelligence function, government organizations would have been especially interested in Eleanor Blackwood's methods for adopting new identities. A more unsettling theory has been put up by others, according to which Eleanor Blackwood might not have been acting alone, but rather as a member of a wider network of identity manipulators, people who had mastered the ability of changing who they were. The methodical approach that may have been taught rather than created is suggested by the cautious target selection, the thorough documentation, and the practice signatures that are all visible in Eleanor's secret workshop. The government's motivation in keeping information about the case under wraps would make sense if such a network existed. It may also help to explain why so many of the investigation's materials are still classified. A similar hidden room was purportedly discovered in 1965, 2 years after it was discovered in the Blackwood mansion, while remodeling a home in Baltimore that belonged to Margaret Sinclair, who had passed away the year before at the age of 81. Unverified reports claim that the room was filled with wigs, identity documents, and newspaper clippings that resembled those in New York. However, federal agents allegedly confiscated all materials from the Baltimore home before any investigation could begin, and the issue was never brought up in public. Was Eleanor Blackwood related to Margaret Sinclair? Did they belong to the same network? Or is this just another urban legend that has clung to the enigmatic air, extending her tale beyond what can be confirmed? We are clear that 11 young ladies vanished from various sites in the Northeast between 1911 and 1917. No one was ever located. They were all similar in certain physical ways. After receiving a job or chance offer from a stranger, they all disappeared. Additionally, Eleanor Blackwood can be located in the area around the time of the disappearance in each instance. Additionally, we are aware that the handwriting that was recognized as belonging to Catherine Miller persists in Eleanor's ledgers for 8 months following Miller's disappearance, before abruptly ceasing. Up until November 1917, Harriet Walsh's handwriting is consistently mentioned in the household accounts. After that, it is never seen again. Additionally, it is said that Eleanor Blackwood passed away in August 1918, yet weeks later, a strikingly identical person named Victoria Caldwell appeared in Boston. The patterns are too full to draw firm conclusions, yet they are also too consistent to be coincidental. We can perceive the contours of a picture without ever being able to identify its complete form, much like a mosaic with important elements missing. In 1969, 1 year following the enigmatic EBA, Modest Private Gallery in Mexico City had a portrait photography exhibition that was featured in the New York Times. Among the pieces on exhibit were 11 pictures of the same woman with minor differences in look, such as varied hairstyles, makeup, and facial expressions. The series was titled Iterations of Self, and was attributed to a photographer who was only identified as E, according to the show catalog. In his review, an American art critic who visited the exhibition observed that the photo's subject had a peculiar quality of both presence and absence, as if she is simultaneously revealing and concealing herself. One has the unsettling sense that these are not merely variations on a theme, but entirely different people wearing the same face, or perhaps the same person wearing different souls. The photos were acquired by an unnamed collector and have not been shown in public since. Shortly after the show and the photographer E, the gallery closed, never again showed up for work there. Was this a visual declaration of Eleanor Blackwood's life's work in identity alteration, her last artistic statement? Or is it just a coincidence, just another strand in the mythology that has developed around her narrative over the years? The case of Eleanor Blackwood and her chorus of shadows continues to rank among the most unsettling instances of identity theft in American history, even in the absence of conclusive explanations. Not because of the stolen goods, but rather because of the potential consequences. 11 lives disrupted, 11 families left without answers, and the potential for the person responsible for these disappearances to have carried on her work unnoticed for decades later. Based on the items discovered in the estate, FBI analysts created a psychological profile of Eleanor Blackwood in the 1,960 seconds, which points to a person with a remarkable ability to compartmentalize and emotionally distance themselves. She seems to have seen identity as a construct that can be put together and taken apart at will, a costume that can be worn rather than a person that can be articulated. Eleanor's peculiar upbringing might be the source of her viewpoint. Caroline was often characterized as weak and reliant, whereas Thomas Blackwood was known to be domineering and emotionally aloof. Eleanor may have learned early on that her survival hinged on becoming whatever her parents wanted her to be, a chameleon adjusting to the emotional climate around her because she grew up in such an atmosphere. It's possible that as Eleanor grew older, this adaptive tactic, which had started off as a protection mechanism, became more strategic. She started actively creating and projecting identities that suited her particular goals, rather than merely reacting to what other people expected of her. According to the ledgers discovered at the home, Eleanor kept thorough records of both monetary transactions and behavioral observations. Such entries contain notes like, "Response to grief story effective, generated immediate sympathy, and deflected questions about background, and Boston accent requires further refinement. Our pronunciation inconsistent." These are not the notes of someone temporarily assuming a role, but rather of someone systematically creating and testing full identities. A person who saw human connection as a sequence of performances that needed to be examined, honed, and perfected is indicated by the level of detail and analysis. However, what was the final objective? What was Eleanor looking for if she was really taking on the identities of the missing women for brief moments before staging her own demise to become Victoria Caldwell for good? Liberation from her own self? The feeling of having several lives? Or something else? An incomplete journal that was found in the hidden room and written in what is thought to be Eleanor's hand may provide some information. One reads, "To be fixed in a single identity is the true death. To be known completely is to be trapped completely. Only by becoming many can I truly be free." Another, written just weeks before her alleged demise, states, "The final transformation approaches. Soon I will shed E completely and step into a new life of my own design. All that has come before has been preparation, learning the methods, testing the boundaries, perfecting the transitions. Now, I am ready to disappear." According to these texts, the author saw traditional identification as a limitation rather than a basis, someone who preferred diversity to authenticity in their quest for emancipation. Perhaps Eleanor believed that her complex lies were a type of rebellion, a means of escaping not only her own particular identity, but also the idea of fixed identity itself. In a time when women's lives were still primarily defined and constrained by social expectations. However, the human cost of this philosophical experiment cannot be ignored. Eleanor's actions seem to have involved the disappearance of 11 young women whose lives and potentials were cut short, whatever of her intentions. They were taken away from their towns, families, and friends. And even if they were not physically hurt, of which we have no proof, they were erased so Eleanor could pretend to be someone else. A person who is able to compartmentalize actions in a way that would allow for the maintenance of a public persona completely detached from private behaviors is suggested by the complex nature of the subject's activities, the apparent lack of emotional attachment to victims, and the meticulous documentation. To put it another way, Eleanor Blackwood seems to have been that most unsettling of people, someone who could hide behaviors that most people would find heinous, while maintaining an entirely normal, even commendable, outward self. Subject demonstrates characteristics consistent with what would now be classified as severe antisocial personality disorder, with elements of narcissistic personality disorder. Her wealth, social standing, and meticulous maintenance of a respectable public image provided the ideal backdrop for her to covertly pursue her true interests. This is the conclusion of the FBI profile. This leads us to what may be the most concerning element of this situation. How many women like Eleanor Blackwood might there be in the present and the past if she was able to lead a secret life and hold on to her place in New York high society, while also orchestrating the disappearances of 11 women? How many people travel the world with meticulously crafted identities that are hardly representative of who they really are? How many people, like Eleanor, have discovered that practically any door can be opened with the correct look, demeanor, and story? How would we ever be able to recognize them for who they really are? Despite never being published in a mainstream journal because much of the case material was classified, a psychology professor at Columbia University wrote a paper in 1972 titled "The Blackwood Paradigm: Identity as Performance in High-Functioning Sociopaths." The paper circulated among law enforcement and intelligence agencies as a framework for understanding people who treat identity as a tactical tool rather than an intrinsic quality. According to the research, these people frequently choose high-status, low-scrutiny social roles that provide them with seclusion and respect, such as quirky professors, affluent widows, and reclusive artists. To explain sporadic absences, they usually create patterns of sporadic withdrawal or travel. They keep exacting records but divulge very little about themselves, and they frequently show an odd fascination with the specifics of other people's lives while disclosing nothing about their own. According to the paper, when these traits are present together, they should be viewed as warning signs, not always of criminal intent, but rather of a fundamental disconnect between the self that is being presented and the self that is actually there. The conclusion of the paper was sobering. The most perfect practitioners of identity as tactical performance will never be identified as such. By definition, those who are most successful at presenting false selves are those least likely to be detected. We can study only the failures and the partial successes, those who left evidence or made mistakes. The true masters remain invisible, their performances so flawless that we accept them without question as the people they claim to be. Despite her apparent proficiency at deceit, Eleanor Blackwood made enough blunders to create a trail, including the meticulous ledgers, the concealed room, and the gathered newspaper clippings. She might never have been linked to the missing ladies if she had just destroyed these documents before to going missing. She could have remained flawless and unnoticed if she hadn't changed into Victoria Caldwell and then Elizabeth Barrett. Are there any other Eleanor Blackwoods who have lived among us and covered their tracks more meticulously or carefully? What flawless performances have we seen and unquestioningly accepted? These are unanswerable questions, insubstantial shadows, and unproven or unproven possibilities. However, the Eleanor Blackwood case serves as a reminder that identity, that which we take to be most essential to our identity, can be more flexible, more pliable, and more susceptible to manipulation than we may want to think. One of the few surviving images of Eleanor Blackwood, shot at a charity function in 1916, was on display in a small exhibit at the Museum of the City of New York in 2018. Her face is partially turned away from the camera as she stands a little apart from a group of socialites. She has impeccable posture, a controlled demeanor, and is finely clothed in the era's fashion. She was assumed to be an affluent, sophisticated heir carrying out her social duties, and nothing about her look suggests anything else. However, with our newfound suspicions about Eleanor Blackwood, the picture assumes a new meaning. She keeps a deliberate distance from the other people in the picture. Her eyes appear to be focused on something in the middle distance rather than on anyone, taking in everything without doing anything. Instead of seeing a lady engaging with society, one sees an actress portraying a character and doing it flawlessly. According to reports, one exhibit visitor stood staring at this picture for almost an hour. She had the right idea. You know, we're all just wearing faces. Some of us are simply more honest about it being a performance. The visitor, who was described as an elderly woman with remarkably good posture, smiled and said, "She had the right idea," before the museum staff member could reply. Years later, researchers looking into the Blackwood case discovered her comment, which had been entered in the daily log, but otherwise ignored. Another vague addendum in a narrative that is nearly entirely made up of unsolved possibilities and unanswered questions. Maybe the next time you look in the mirror, you'll pause to consider how many different faces you've worn throughout the course of your life, and how many different versions of yourself you've shown to various individuals in various situations. And maybe you'll think about how blurry the boundary is between creating whole fake identities and adjusting to social circumstances. That line was clearly crossed by Eleanor Blackwood. She transitioned from social adaptability to something far more sinister, from adaptation to fabrication. By doing this, she created a history of deceptions, disappearances, and unsettling inquiries into the very meaning of identity. Officially, the Blackwood heir case is still open. 11 women who vanished between 1911 and 1917 are still unaccounted for. Additionally, if Eleanor did stage her death and adopt new identities, she has long ago disappeared from history, leaving behind only echoes and pieces, whispers and shadows, and the lingering doubt regarding her true identity beneath all of her meticulously crafted facade.